Okay, welcome to the fourth video on the fourth meditation. In this video, I'll be continuing my discussion of judgment and the cooperation of the will and the intellect in forming beliefs through judging. And in particular, I'll be looking at how Descartes thinks error is possible, how this cooperation of the understanding and the will, the intellect and the will, can go awry. And when do we go awry in judging? Well, when we fall into error, right? When we take something to be the case that isn't the case, when we affirm something that's false, or when we take something not to be the case that is the case, when we deny something that's true. That's when we fall into error. That's when we make mistakes. So why? Why do we make mistakes? I mean, you might want to pause the video and think about this, right? I mean, so notice that God creates our wills and our intellect, so both are perfect in their kind. Our intellect is perfectly good in its kind. So, is it our intellect that goes wrong? Is it our intellect that goes wrong? Well, it's perfectly good in its kind. So no, it can't go wrong. Our intellect is like God's in that it has or receives ideas, but does not judge. Judging happens both for us and for God through the will. Our will is free. This means that we do the judging and are responsible for the judging. Now, both our wills and our intellects are created by God. And so it can't be in the nature of either our will or our intellect to deceive us. Rather, both our will and our intellect are perfectly good. Right? Both are perfect in their kind. That is, good in their kind, right? They're perfectly good for the kind of intellects and wills that they are, belonging to this finite thing. I mean, you might wonder, well, what does this mean? I mean, what does it mean to be perfect in its kind? What is that? I mean, we're finite things, and so the way that our minds work is different than the way that God's mind works, right? We saw that in the last meditation. But what could it mean to be perfect in its kind? What could it mean for our intellect to be perfect in its kind? What could it mean for our will to be perfect in its kind? Well, let me give you an example and turn the page here. Okay. So our intellect is perfect. It's perfectly good in its kind as a finite intellect. And the way you can try to understand this, an analogy that can sort of help, is it's like a perfect Honda. Right? It works well, it gets us around, it does what we need it to. You know, it performs all right. It's reliable. But this Honda, it's never gonna be a Lamborghini. It's never gonna be a Lamborghini. It's just not gonna get there. It's never gonna be as good of a car as a Lamborghini. And even if the Honda were the best possible Honda, perfect in its kind, it would never be as good of a car as the Lamborghini. Okay, so why does this help us with judging going awry? Right, so the idea is, well, our intellect and our will, they're perfect in their kind. Our intellect is like the perfect Honda. God is like the Lamborghini. right? God's intellect, God's understanding is like the Lamborghini, and it's just better than we are. Even if we're perfect in our kind, our intellect can never be anything so perfect as God's, right? They're just different kinds of things. Now, why can this help us in figuring out how judging can go awry? How can we make mistakes? Well, we can abuse the will. We can abuse the will. That's Descartes' answer. We can abuse the will. Why? How? How does this happen? Well, this happens when we affirm something that we don't fully understand. If we use our will where we understand, if we only use our will where we understand something clearly and distinctly, then we'll never go wrong. When we do this, when we always use it correctly, we'll get things right, and it'll never lead us astray. So long as we only use it when we're perceiving clearly and distinctly, we'll never go wrong. And I mean, here's this, I guess I wrote it here, but this is a point that's been with us for a while, right? So when Descartes talks about perception, he doesn't mean what we now mean by perception, right? He doesn't mean something that we see with our eyes or our senses. Rather, he means something closer to what we mean by conceive, think of in the mind, right? Okay, so how does this abuse of the will, how does this work? Well, we'll be making good use of the will if we only affirm what we understand clearly and distinctly. And when we do this, when we always use it correctly, we'll get things right and we're never led astray. So it's when we, mere finite apprentices in knowledge that we are, misuse the tools that are given to us to know things that we make mistakes, right? So it's when we make judgments about things in ways that our tools were not meant to, that we're led astray. And just because God gave us a free will that we can sometimes misuse doesn't make this will any less perfect, right? So just because I can make judgments about things that I don't fully understand, that I don't perceive clearly and distinctly, and so go wrong, that doesn't mean that God is evil. That doesn't make God any less perfect. Why? Why? I mean, here I put it as an objection, but wait, we can misuse our will. So doesn't that make it imperfect? Doesn't that make our will imperfect? No, right? After all, with the will, there are only two options, affirming and denying. And in this respect, our will is just like God's. In this respect, our will is just like God's. He too either has to affirm or deny. And there's nothing in our will that forces us to go wrong, to misuse our will, to affirm when we aren't perceiving clearly and distinctly. Rather, Descartes says that it's our will that is the most important perfection, where our most important perfection lies, right? It's through the correct use of our will that we can stop ourselves from judging falsely. And it's through the correct use of our will that we can come closest to knowing things in the way that God knows things. And so it's through our will that we can attain perfection, right? So if we go back to the prior page, right, it's only through our will that we can attain perfection, knowledge, right? And so it's only through our will that we can maintain our weakness, our ignorance, when we should maintain our weakness and our ignorance. So our will is really the tool by which we exhibit our perfection. So in the next video, I'll turn to the different uses of the will and the different ways of maintaining perfection, and sort of make more clear how this error is possible.